Hi, everybody. My name is Sarah Dorr. I work for the International Studies Association as their Director of Professional Development. I'm so pleased that you're able to join this joint ISA a virtual event that we've put on. I am actually going to turn this over to my co-organizer, Rebecca Petty, who's going to tell you a little bit about this initiative.
Thank you, Sarah. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everyone, as we are in all different zones, I believe, today. Welcome. I'm Rebecca Petty from University of Macedonia and European International Studies Association. And together with Sarah, we are very happy to introduce a new joint initiative between ISA and EISA. It's an opportunity to harness the vast amount of knowledge and experience in our communities and discuss contemporary issues within the international system. Today, we are discussing international security. Esteemed speakers from both sides of the Atlantic will help us take a 60-degree view on pressing international security challenges. And without further delay, I'll give the floor to Sarah to introduce our speakers, which will give us again a 360-degree view on international security pressing challenges.
Okay, so we have 4 speakers today. We're going to start with Olena Lennon. She is a practitioner in residence of national security at the University of New Haven. This is going to be followed by Neil Oculi, who is an interdisciplinary political geographer based at the University of Portland. Then we have Thomas Juneau, who is an assistant professor at the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. And finally, we have Professor Christian Kaunert, who is a professor of international security at Dublin City University. So each of the presenters is going to speak a little bit about what they think you need to know about security these days, and then we're going to have time for a discussion. And all of the attendees, feel free to write your comments and your questions in the chat or in the Q&A. So I will turn it over to Olena.
All right. Thank you so much, Sarah, and thank you, ISA, for organizing this event. And incredible to see so many people in attendance. Thank you so much for taking time out of your busy days on a summer day too to be with us today. So what I'm going to talk about to kick this off is ways in which Russia's aggression against Ukraine has changed the world, and I'm going to try and stay away from using the narrative of rules-based international order. I think my argument mainly is that Russia's war against Ukraine has not necessarily changed the world order, because I don't think that world order existed, as it were, but it changed a system of international relations as we knew it. So I'm going to offer 5 main aspects or elements in which I believe Russia's war against Ukraine is a global event. It's not limited to Ukraine, obviously, even though Ukrainians are, suffering the most. But it has completely upended the world as we knew it, a system of relationships, however disorderly it was before the invasion. It has, tremendously affected every single aspect of our daily lives, even, people outside Ukraine, obviously. So I'll walk you through, 5 main points in the interest of time. I'll try and consolidate them into 5 points. And then hopefully we'll have a discussion afterwards if there's anything else that you may be interested in. But, as I'm sure is not a secret to anybody, Russia's renewed invasion of Ukraine in February of 2022. And I want to emphasize that this was a reinvasion on a much larger scale, but the initial invasion started in 2014. It has brought the deadliest armed conflict to the European continent since World War II and completely upended regional and global security architecture. Nobody expected a conventional war of this scale to transpire in Europe. I think, even before 2022, conversations about a potential global conflict mostly revolved around the use of AI, and there was sort of various war games simulating confrontation in cyber domain, mostly as sort of technology and advanced weaponry were sort of making their way into warfare. But what the war in Ukraine, the war against Ukraine has shown is that the war, a massive land war of attrition is not obsolete. We're not immune from it. The current war against Ukraine, and it's fought primarily on the Ukrainian territory, although, as we know, just most recently, most Western capitals have finally given Ukraine permission to use some of the Western-produced weapons, longer-range weapons against targets on the Russian territory. But it's a war that is currently characterized by trenches, human wave attacks, artillery barrages against civilians. It's a war against the Ukrainian population and civilian infrastructure, massive casualties on both sides. So it's a very human endeavor with close quarter contact, with urban warfare, with civilians being targeted in airstrikes. So in that way, I think in one of the ways in which it has completely sort of upended our understanding of warfare and technological advancement is that this is a war currently decided almost entirely by artillery. It's a numbers game where the size of mobilized army and the quantity of artillery pieces available to two conventional armies are decisive. And I think that is something that was kind of overlooked in discussions or less anticipated in discussions preceding the large-scale invasion. But it's also a war that is one of the largest humanitarian catastrophes in Europe, with the potential to get even worse. It's a war in which a permanent member of the UN Security Council endorses its military to commit war crimes for population control. But it also showed that Russia's violations of international law are not only a threat to Ukraine's survival, but a threat to regional and global security writ large. Of course, it has, I think, really revealed weaknesses in the international system in terms of not only punishing crime of aggression, the mother of all crimes, crime of aggression, but also fundamentally failing to prevent it. So the current international legal system is fundamentally flawed and ineffective in preventing nation states, permanent members of Security Council, in waging genocidal wars of attrition against another state. So it wouldn't be an exaggeration to say that not a single person in Ukraine, and including Ukrainians abroad, has not been affected by the war in one way or another. So whether people lost their homes or they or their family members have been wounded, killed, or are currently risking their lives on the front lines, obviously created a massive refugee crisis in Europe and elsewhere. So it is changing the social fabric. Ukrainian refugees are changing the social fabric of many of the countries to which they're relocating. But of course, Ukrainians are the ones suffering the most. At least a quarter of Ukrainian population has been displaced, and the numbers grow every day. Not to mention war crimes against children, forceful displacement of children by the Russian forces, which has amounted to genocide, according to the International Criminal Court. Ukrainian economy, civilian infrastructure, has been badly damaged. So within that sort of destruction, I want to emphasize two main points that are particularly relevant to a global system of relationships. And one is how Russia's behavior has fundamentally changed anything we knew about nuclear escalation and nuclear deterrence. So by lowering the threshold for the use of nuclear weapons and normalizing conversations about nuclear escalation, where the Russians, not a day goes by that the Russians don't make another threat of deploying nuclear weapons in theater or long-range strategic nuclear weapons, it has completely changed our understanding of how nuclear deterrence works and where the lines can be drawn. It has normalized the conversation, as far as the use of nuclear weapons is concerned, to where the conversation is moving toward from deterrence to warfighting. Nuclear weapons being more and more and more normalized in our imagination as a warfighting tool, as a weapon that can augment conventional forces, and that is extremely dangerous. It has created such levels of instability and insecurity and uncertainty in the world that I think are really dangerous in terms of what it means for nuclear escalation and normalization of nuclear weapons. So Russia's responsibility for increasing nuclear risks is not limited to its saber rattling in Ukraine, but it's also the fact that it has de-ratified comprehensive nuclear test ban treaty. It has suspended the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, New START. It vetoed a UN resolution preventing the deployment of nuclear weapons in space. And it also vetoed a UN Security Council resolution to extend the mandate of the North Korea panel of experts that oversees North Korea's compliance with sanctions. So all of that is extremely dangerous. Number two, and I'll quickly walk you through the remaining points. So global economic disruptions. Russia's invasion sent shockwaves through global food supply lines, spiked food inflation, and also created new insecurity over supply chain, particularly in some of the poorer parts of the world, such as Africa and Middle East. So those are the regions where hundreds of millions of people face chronic hunger, and then what the war has revealed once again is that around half of food imports available to a lot of countries in Africa and Middle East came from Russia and Ukraine combined. So it has fundamentally compromised food supplies in some of the more fragile and unstable regions. And what's even more dangerous about that situation is the fact that hunger and food supplies have been weaponized and have been leveraged by the Russians to extract concessions from the West. So, Putin has used grain exports from Ukraine as a way to leverage against the West and to prevent the West from supporting Ukraine. So I think it's a very dangerous precedent to be exploiting basic needs such as food to achieve foreign policy objectives of dubious origin. Number three, I think that the war in Ukraine has led to a new arms race and militarization, particularly of European economies. Currently, we're seeing an increase that in the most Western countries are increasing their defense industrial capacity, in which they need to, because they obviously are now facing a massive shortage of ammunition, given the realities of the battlefield. But it's also, creating a whole new moment in history where the Europeans are remilitarizing and rearming and reallocating their resources from civilian to defense purposes. So I think it's going to create further shifts in the system of international relationships. Next, environmental impact. Ukraine is currently one of the most heavily mine-contaminated countries in the world. About 1/5, about 20% of Ukraine's territory is currently occupied by the Russian forces. A lot of that land is farmland that is, heavily contaminated, and obviously also is going to affect Ukraine's economy, its ability to export grains and feed their own population. But what's even more is the fact that the level of contamination created by warfare is not going to stay in Ukraine. Obviously, there's a lot of dangerous military activity around nuclear power plants in eastern Ukraine. Water is contaminated, soil is contaminated, farmland, trees. A war zone obviously is, war is, devastating to the environment. But I think that the long-term repercussions of the effects on not just the Ukrainian wildlife and farmland, but also on the continent and globally are overlooked sometimes. And lastly, the last, I think, takeaway for me from the last, particularly from the last 2 years, and I'm going to end on a kind of more philosophical note. I think it's just once again reminded us of the power of ideas and the power of human agency. I think Ukrainians have surprised the world in terms of claiming agency and fighting for their nationhood and self-determination. And I think that is in and of itself empowering and sends a very strong signal across the world that people have agency. People can mobilize their power around values and around what matters and change the status quo. At the same time, authoritarian leaders, let's just call them bad guys, also have agency. The fact that Putin has agency to execute his historical revisionism, his ideas that Ukrainian nation doesn't exist with impunity is also dangerous. So ideas matter. Where people get information matters. Where governments that are fed inaccurate curated information, such as Putin's security services that have falsified records, that have fed the government inaccurate information about Ukrainian history, that have allowed Putin to execute these ideas against Ukrainians matter. So that is my way of saying that Russia's threat is not only in its ability to inflict tremendous amounts of physical destruction, but also in its influence operations. It's the various hybrid techniques in changing people's ways of thinking about history and changing people's ideas about who they are and what matters is important, and where people get information is important. And I think that the war in Ukraine, once again, is a reminder that executing factually inaccurate ideas can have quite literally lethal outcomes. And I'll end on that note, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Olena. And Olena already mentioned the environmental challenges because of the war in Ukraine, and we will have Neil Oculi to talk more about environmental challenges in international security. The floor is yours, Neil.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here talking to you on security in various forms and fashion. Today, I'm going to look at security a bit different. Instead of thinking about security in relation to a hot war or conflict, I'm focusing on climate change and its impact on small island developing states. And the big argument I make here is that the hazard, the event, as it relates to climate change is the security threat. So we see in the Caribbean, in the Pacific region, in the Indian Ocean, where all island nations have hazards becoming quite the reason why those small island developing states face various security threats. And the conversation is much more than just security threats, but it's also a call for climate justice, I think, and reparations. The science tells us that this decade is a critical decade to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees Celsius, and that is the threshold that a lot of island nations are talking about. Climate change has become a first-order security threat for small island developing states, meaning that, as I said, the hazard is in fact the conflict. It's a war against. I would characterize it as a war against a force that is that we are ill prepared to deal with, partly because of a lot of the global issues facing small island developing states. In 2017, for example, and here's a quote from Dominican Prime Minister Roosevelt Skerrit addressing the UN Assembly. He says, and I quote, "I come straight to you from the front line on the war of climate change. Mr. President, to deny climate change is to procrastinate while the earth sinks. It is to deny a truth that we have just lived." And I think Skerrit's point brings a very important reality for small island developing states. The fact that, for example, just that storm in 2017, Dominica experienced losses of about 1.5 billion because of that hurricane, or 224% of its gross domestic product, with significant loss in housing and the tourism sector. So again, one storm can create such security threats for small and developing states that it would create generational poverty or impact on the countries for multi-generation. So the Atlantic hurricane season, as I said, in 2017 was one of the worst in the Caribbean seas. Hundreds of people lost their lives. We had destroyed of property, and sometimes the entire islands were destroyed. Hurricane Emma, for example, caused up to 230 miles per hour and destroyed over 90% of buildings in Bermuda, leaving the island uninhabited for the first time in over 300 years. And that is at the backdrop of climate-induced displacement with little or no national policy plans or strategies. We had Hurricane Irma and Maria, both Category 5 storms within 2 weeks of each other, impacting the Caribbean. About 3 million people from 16 countries and territories in the region were displaced due to that hurricane. Entire islands in both Antigua and Barbuda and the Bahamas were displaced. And as a result, we had the population of Antigua, for example, increasing overnight because it had to, by a lot, because it had to accommodate the movement of people who became climate refugees during that time. So for small and developing states, this impact, this idea of losses and damages create a lot of issues. So what happens when countries become permanent refugee due to climate change? You have loss of culture, statelessness, and forced migration. All of those things that happen when you have global conflict that is more traditional, or conflict that is more traditional, like the one in Ukraine, for example, and other parts of the world. So in essence, I would argue that small island developing states are at the front line of that crisis, that climate crisis, for increased temperatures, change in precipitation, acidification of the ocean, more severe storm events, and we must account for loss and damage of property and all of forced migration. And this is one of the, on the international scale, this idea of loss and damage has received more traction within the UNFCCC, within the climate change negotiating ecosystem. But we are way behind as to how to deal with those impacts of losses and damages. And what do we do with those non-economic losses, as I mentioned, those things that is much more difficult to quantify in terms of statelessness and in terms of sovereignty and loss of culture. So climate change continues to become a security threat for small island developing states. I would say while we are thinking of a lot of the global conflict this conflict against nature seems much more, it's much more complex, and you have both physical sovereignty, human life being impacted, and a lack of urgency on the international scale to address those issues. So you have, I would say, an international political vacuum as to what are the approaches and the ways to do it. The solutions, I would say, are not novel. Small island developing states have been talking about this from the onset of the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, the call for some kind of mechanism to deal with the potential threats, or an insurance mechanism was put on the table on the onset of the UNFCCC in the early 1990s, but it has fallen on deaf ears. We do have in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt in 2022, the loss and damage fund was agreed on, and it was operationalized last year. But even the composition of the fund and how the fund will be administered and hasn't been hashed out. We do have a lot of commitments by countries during those negotiations, but in terms of action and in terms of providing the resources to deal with losses and damages, historically countries have not met those obligations. And we do not have a mechanism to talk about non-economic losses and damages in a way that will address those human security needs that I just mentioned. So in keeping with the 10 minutes, I will conclude here, but I would say that climate change is the security threat for small island developing states. Hazards are that first order security, meaning that we are at war or fighting with forces that are beyond our control and that we have little to do with it, while we have the ethical or the moral argument in terms of getting countries to commit to deal with those impacts of climate change for vulnerable states across the world, like island nations. We haven't had enough commitments. I will conclude here, and I wait for any discussions and questions on that issue. Thank you.
Thank you, Neil, for turning our attention to such a pressing challenge. And we will turn our attention to the Middle East now. Houthis made the headlines, or are still making the headlines, challenge the international trade, and not only this. So Thomas Juneau from University of Ottawa will help us navigate causes and consequences of the Houthis' growing regional role. Thomas, the floor is yours.
Thank you, and thank you very much for the invitation to speak today. So in the few minutes that I have, I will focus on two main points. The first one being to try to unpack a bit the threat that the Houthis pose to maritime shipping in the Red Sea. And the second point, what can be done about it. So my first point on the Houthi threat, I think the key takeaway will be that the threat that the Houthis pose to Red Sea shipping is a long-term problem. It is not an issue that will go away in the short term. Just to put it quickly in context, you've probably all seen this in the media. The Red Sea, and especially its southern tip, the Bab el-Mandab, is a key choke point for the global economy. A bit more than 10% of maritime shipping transits through the Bab el-Mandab on a daily basis. And the Houthis have really ramped up their attacks in the southern half of the Red Sea, especially since the beginning of the war in Gaza in October. There had been Houthi attacks prior to 2023, but on a much smaller scale. you often hear that there actually is a very easy answer or solution to the threat that the Houthis pose to Red Sea shipping, and that's a ceasefire in Gaza. There are very good reasons to want a ceasefire in Gaza. It's certainly a position that I would support, but for other reasons. Unfortunately, a ceasefire in Gaza would not lead to any kind of permanent end to the threat that the Houthis pose to Red Sea shipping, simply because the Houthis have clearly shown in the last 8 months now that they have both the capability and the intent to disrupt shipping in the Red Sea, and this will simply not stop. The Gaza war for the Houthis has not been the cause of all this. It has been a pretext, and the difference is not semantics, and it's actually very important. The Houthis have been able to use these attacks to mobilize domestic support, and I'll get back to this a bit more quickly and a bit more later. And they have also been using the crisis in Gaza as an opportunity to emerge and to consolidate their position, not only as a power inside Yemen, but as a regional player. And it is working very well on both fronts for them. And this will continue after Gaza. Their intent to emerge as a regional power will not simply disappear. In terms of capabilities, happy to talk more in the Q&A if people have more detailed questions, but just quickly, in large part thanks to Iranian support, most of the capabilities that the Houthis use to disrupt shipping in the Red Sea have not been generated purely locally, unlike some of their other capabilities. We're talking about underwater drones, drone boats, aerial drones, a variety of missiles, both ballistic and cruise missiles, amphibious assault teams that they have used fairly well. And crucially, and this is an area where they have significantly improved in recent months, it's the ability to do surveillance and targeting inside the Red Sea. And this is something that they have been doing in large part with Iranian assistance. Iran, until recently at least, long had a ship that was just floating around in the Red Sea. And in practice, everybody strongly suspected that it was to help with the Houthis targeting in the area. And again, these are capabilities that will stay beyond any kind of resolution, hopefully, to what is going on in Gaza. Part of the reason for this is that there should be no doubt, given the Houthis' level of ambition, which is very high, that they will use, or at least they will threaten to use, disruption in the Red Sea in the future to pressure their adversaries. That could be related to Gaza. If, speaking hypothetically, there's a ceasefire in Gaza at some point, but then, as I think, unfortunately, we have to expect, there will be significant challenges in terms of post-war governance in Gaza, post-war stabilization and reconstruction, and so on. You can fully expect the Houthis to use the threat of disrupting shipping in the Red Sea to pressure Israel and the US, for example. In other circumstances, they could very well use that threat again to pressure Saudi Arabia in the context of Yemen's own faltering peace process. And the latter, pressuring Saudi Arabia, will or could very well work. And you know, to understand this, it helps to understand why Saudi Arabia has been keeping such a low profile in terms of the crisis in the Red Sea since January in particular. Saudi Arabia is not technically a member of the American-led coalition that has been striking the Houthis. It has not sent a ship to the Red Sea, not because it opposes American efforts, not at all, but because it fears Houthi retaliation, plain and simple. The Houthis have established a deterrent relationship here that has allowed them to pressure Saudi Arabia in keeping a low profile for fear of Houthi missile and drone attacks. If you remember, about 4 years ago now, for example, there was an attack on just before a Formula One car race in Jeddah in Saudi Arabia that caused significant anxiety in Saudi Arabia. If you put this in the context of Saudi Arabia's significant efforts to reform its economy, open up to trade, open up to investment, open up to tourism, and so on, Houthi missiles and drones represent a significant threat to these socioeconomic reform plans. I won't get into detail at that level, but you can make a very similar argument for the UAE. So the bottom line is that the Houthi threat to Red Sea shipping is here to stay, irrespective of what happens in Gaza. And the key here is the ideology and level of ambition of the Houthis. They are very ambitious. They have a very expansive ideology and worldview. They are very much opposed to the status quo in the region, US dominated, Israel, Saudi Arabia dominated. And I would even add that to some extent you can use the word hubristic to describe their approach. They have won the civil war in Yemen, as I'll discuss briefly in my second half, and they perceive a window of opportunity to exploit their strong position right now, in not only inside Yemen, but to push beyond Yemen's borders. So question two, in just a few small minutes, what do we do about this? And by we, I mean the US, but the Europeans and other countries regionally, including Saudi Arabia and others. There has been a lot of criticism of the US approach, especially since mid-January, when the US and the UK started striking the Houthis from the air. There have been a few more strikes in recent days, notably that have caused reportedly civilian casualties. These strikes have had a limited impact in terms of degrading Houthi capabilities. There has been some damage, hard to quantify precisely, but certainly some damage. But the problem is that Houthi capabilities, bases, missile launching sites, infrastructure, and so on are extremely scattered throughout a very mountainous country, or at least the part of the country that the Houthis control is very mountainous. And this is the result of almost 10 years of the Houthis facing a war from Saudi Arabia, which has led them to really scatter their installations throughout the country. So it's very hard to hit. So not only has the impact of American strikes been limited, in fact, the Houthis have really milked these strikes for propaganda gains. Domestically, this has been a winner for the Houthis. They have been able to paint themselves as the leaders of the resistance against, quote unquote, US, Israeli, Saudi aggression. Whether you agree with that or not, that's what the Houthis have been doing, and it works for them. They have been able to mobilize very strong pro-Palestinian feelings inside Yemen. And regionally, you can say something similar, in the sense that the Houthis have been able to shame or to pressure regional adversaries like Saudi Arabia and others who have not taken a strong pro-Palestinian position opposed to Israel and the US. And this has allowed them to pressure adversaries and to build their own regional profile in many ways. So what the US has been doing so far is a bad option. It hasn't been working well. The problem is that it's not clear to me that there's an alternative option that would clearly work better from the US's perspective. At one end of the spectrum, the option of doing nothing doesn't strike me as a viable option, or a superior option, I should say, simply because the Houthis have clearly shown, and if there's one thing that we should learn from their emergence in the past 10 to 15 years, is that when they perceive a vacuum, they expand in it, and quite aggressively. So doing nothing is not clearly, to me, a superior option. On the other side of the spectrum, doing a lot more, i.e. attacking the Houthis much more hardly, is also clearly, to me, not a superior option to the current one, because of the risk of escalation, because of the risk of getting bogged down, because of the risk of civilian casualties, keeping in mind the context where in 10 years of war in Yemen, there have already been hundreds of thousands of casualties. So is the very imperfect option where the US and the UK, for that matter, are now, which is of limited strikes, the least bad option along that spectrum? I'm not sure yet, but it might be a defensible position. Now, at this point, you could easily say, well, the solution has to be political. In theory, yes. In practice, the problem goes back to the point I mentioned a few minutes ago, that the Houthis are not in any mood at all to negotiate politically with anyone, whether it's Saudi Arabia or the US or the UN or anybody else. They perceive that they have won the civil war, which technically is accurate. They have won. Nobody on the ground in Yemen comes close to being able to challenge them politically or militarily. They are not negotiating. There is no peace process in Yemen right now, not because anybody else doesn't want to, because they don't want to. Their notion of post-war politics in Yemen is their domination, and that simply is where they are right now. And technically, it's not an inaccurate perception, because they have won. The internationally recognized government, which the US and Saudi Arabia supports, is extraordinarily weak and corrupt and incompetent and perceived as illegitimate by a large proportion of the Yemeni population. So it is not a viable partner on the ground right now to build up an anti-Houthi front. And in fact, this is an important point because we've talked a lot about over the years of Iran's support for the Houthis, which is absolutely true. Iran's support for the Houthis has been essential. But I would say that equally, if not more important to the Houthis' emergence has not been Iran's support. It has been the, to put it bluntly, the incompetence of anti-Houthi forces. Power is a relative thing. So Iran's support has made the Houthis more powerful, but ultimately it's the weakness of the Houthis' adversaries that has allowed them to win. You do read in some US media or think tank circles or elsewhere that the US could support individual factions inside the regional, the government, the internationally recognized government, some of them on the coast of the Red Sea to counter Houthi attacks. That is a very bad idea. That would simply reinforce the dynamics that over the years have allowed the Houthis to emerge, which again is the fragmentation of anti-Houthi forces. So the only long-term answer, if the outcome is to be something else than Houthi domination of Yemen, has got to be a strengthening of the internationally recognized government. But that's been tried for 10 years and has not only not succeeded, it has abysmally failed. So bottom line, and I'll conclude on this, just over my 10 minutes, apologies for that. The Houthi threat to Red Sea shipping is a threat that is there to stay, simply because there is no on-the-ground dynamic that would allow the emergence of anti-Houthi forces that could change that reality, certainly not for the short to midterm. Thank you.
Thank you, Thomas, and last but not least, Christian Kaunert, who will introduce the non-state actors topic. We have learned a lot about the Houthis, and what's next, Christian?
Right, thank you, Rebecca. It's a great pleasure, a great honor to be there at this fantastic event. We've heard some really fantastic comments already before, so I'm really very, very excited to be talking with you today. Now, what I want to talk about really is almost directly following what Thomas was saying just earlier. He was talking specifically about the Houthis. Obviously, the big reason that we're all very interested in that particular topic right now is the 7th of October, the Hamas attacks on Israel. But of course, what I'm going to do is to try and put a long-term perspective on this, because what we're dealing with, as it were at the moment, is not something of a recent phenomenon. What we're dealing with is a very, very long-term phenomenon. If you're looking at a variety of different terror groups, you're actually seeing state sponsorship of terrorism groups. You're seeing that going back all the way to the 19th century. So it isn't something that is very specific to this particular time, although it has been used in a specific and particular way. And I'll expand on that as we get on. So let me just first talk about that in terms of its links. And its links are very, very important because its links are very deep and they're particularly related with its links to organized crime. If you're looking at the whole nexus between terrorism, state sponsorship of terrorism, the holy trinity, if you like, is then the link with organized crime. And why is that link so important? Because the links between terrorism and organized crime, they were already pre-existing state sponsorship of terrorism. They were already prevalent, as it were, and established in the 19th century. There were already alliances between various revolutionary political movements and the underworlds that can be found all the way back in the 19th centuries. Alliances can be observed also in the 20th centuries, in the new terrorist movements, for instance, in Germany, as well as in North America. We can see that in recent years, we've had a growing interest in this particular research area. It's been a research area in exploring the relationship between terrorist movements, non-state actors, in particular in relation to organized crime. A number of different scholars have done really excellent work in terms of network approaches. But what we know so far very often is that perhaps of very, very good analytical descriptions, but people haven't really theorized that perhaps to the extent that one may wish. But in general, we can suggest that these new forms of terrorism, they're essentially based on a number of different illicit economies and markets of violences. We have a disappearance of a configuration of power structure. I mean, obviously, we had a very clear power structure during the time of the Cold War. We had the two global superpowers, and as it were, the terrorist groups tended to be organized in a similar way. They were organized along the same lines as the global power structure was manifesting itself in that Cold War period. They were basically characterized by the support of either one or the other of the superpowers. Now, as the Cold War was ending, and as we saw this transitioning from the Eastern Europe, the superpowers were starting to withdraw, at least partially, from financing violent actors and insurgent groups. In some areas, those superpowers were then replaced by regional powers. Now, the Iranians might take issue with my description of them as a regional power. Of course, in their own self-perceptions, they don't see themselves as a regional power, they see themselves as a global power, but certainly not a superpower. And their whole idea in terms of using Hezbollah, using Hamas, using all sorts of different terror groups as in a sense, as an amplifier of regional power is nothing new, except that it is a very, very efficient way of projecting their own power in the region for a relatively small amount of money, if you will. Very often states, and sometimes you have willing diaspora also outside of those states, they're available, sometimes they're not available sources of funds. You need obviously arms in order to develop terror attacks. You need violent groups that are also dependent on whether they're able to, in a sense, finance their activities. They need to be able to finance those activities on a regular basis, what we might call acquisitional activities. So participating in those economic activities makes sense in those areas where violent groups have that particular competitive advantage. A competitive advantage clearly of terrorist groups lies in their ability to exert effective violence or to exploit a reputation of effective violence. So over the last decades, we've seen that there have been a number of different changes in this. We've seen an internationalization of networks. We've seen an internationalization of conflicts. Now, what we're experiencing at the moment when it comes to the whole issue of Hamas and Israel is clearly the most internationalized aspect of this particular conflict that we've seen before. Obviously, this goes back to the late 1960s, early 1970s. We see for the first time, obviously, Yasser Arafat attending the UN General Assembly as a first step towards that internationalization of that conflict. We see that having reached, in a sense, a certain pinnacle of internationalization. We see that as we see it in a general propaganda, as we can see it on the internet, we see that in the media reporting, we see the internationalization as it were in front of our eyes. We have new forms in terms of war and violence. We have an asymmetric nature of those new wars. We have an asymmetric nature also of the hybrid warfare dimension of this aspect. We have an increasing involvement of actors that perhaps are not only state actors or are not directly state actors, but could be seen as a privatization, private actors that are also involved in this. We have the development of failed and weak states, abundant resources in terms of recruitment. As we can see, increasingly, this is being very, very well funded, and we see that those transnational organized crime networks are linked clearly to terrorism through various shadow economies and transnational networks. Those economies are, of course, driven by the law of individual countries, by providing opportunities for those networks to exist, by opening market opportunities for those networks to develop, flourish, in a sense, develop their regular income through the structure of the political economy and definition, scope, and content of the trafficking and smuggling, of course, whether that is drugs, whether that is organized crime, weapons, violence, but also by demand emerging from within conventional society and so on. In particular here, the main markets that should be of concern are drug markets. One of the ways in which you can identify, for instance, certain terror groups from acting, let's take Hezbollah just for an example, is that you see a lot of drug activity, drug import, export, drug activity in general around the areas where those groups are also operating. You see the trafficking of women, you see the trafficking of immigrants, labor forces. You see other forms of acquisitional crime that are often linked to them. For instance, ransom, robbery, theft, fraud. You see, of course, illegal capital, money laundering. We see all sorts of aspects linked to, in a sense, new forms of those type of illegal activities, whether that includes bitcoins or whatever else you might see in these days. But all of those things are, in a sense, linked to the old networks of terror groups that used to exist. Now, I'll give you just one example from European history. And then, of course, in the 1970s, we had the development of the left-wing terrorist group, the Baader-Meinhof. In Germany, for instance, we obviously had a variety of different terror groups also in other Western European countries. We had, of course, the IRA, we had ETA in Spain, we had also the Red Brigades in Italy. We had non-European terror groups on European soils. We had, for instance, PLO, of course, that was operating also on European soil, the PKK. All of those were, in a sense, operating outside of their general framework. But if I just give you that one example of the Red Army faction, founded at the time by Ulrike Meinhof and, in a sense, supported by other actors. Now, what we nowadays know, of course, is that the person who was defending the Baader-Meinhof the terrorists in court at the time, Horst Mahler, he was actually an active Stasi agent. So he was run by East German secret intelligence and with his specific purpose of running the left-wing German groups on behalf, of course, of the KGB, very often linked with anti-Americanism, similar also in its scopes to of course, terrorism of the Red Brigades also in Italy, linked in terms of ideology to the kind of third world liberation movements that was also supported by the Soviet Union, of course, at the time. But interestingly, also to make the link into today's terror groups, also very deeply embedded in some of the far-right groups. So, for instance, Horst Mahler, who was the Stasi agent, who was, in a sense, running the Baader-Meinhof, he later became one of the very important neo-Nazis in West Germany in the 1990s. He was very deeply linked into the whole far-right movements and was very much in that space also. So just to mention here that, in a sense, these are not new developments. We can go through that. I won't take too much more of your time because we have to also discuss some of those issues in more detail. But just to mention here that these are older developments that have existed for a number of decades, really. It's about the global system as a whole. It's about undermining rivals, bleeding rivals. It's about power projection. Certainly, Iran has played that card very strongly in terms of power projection, developing regional power in a way that is relatively cheap, playing the spoiler. Certainly, you can see that with the latest attack of 7th of October, the idea of playing the spoiler of the rapprochement between, of course, Saudi Arabia and Israel was a very important driver in the attacks. Intimidation, working with violent sub-state actor groups. That's where the organized crime networks are so important, because they're very much driving that, and of course, deterrence and revenge. We clearly see that all of those are important functions that those activities are meant to foster. So I'll leave on that note. Thank you very much, and I look forward to a discussion.
Okay, thank you so much for all of these really interesting and presentations, and they really showed how these issues are all connected, which I think sometimes we tend to examine them in isolation, and this 360-degree examination was really helpful to see the connections between all of these different security challenges that we're facing today. So I am going to start with a question that came in for Christian, and the question is, how can academics research alleged terrorist criminal group ties when politicians or law enforcement agencies might have an interest in construing such links without existing as evidence for such ties?
I think that's a good question. How can academics investigate those things? I think very often it's very difficult to investigate that at the time that it happens. If we look, for instance, at the Baader-Meinhof links, I mean, a number of those links became apparent 20 years later. So it's not that we were perfectly able to research them as events were unfolding, but we certainly, when it came to, for instance, the Stasi links, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, of course, some of the Stasi archives were open, so we were able to actually look at the documents, were able to investigate the kind of links that existed. But even then, of course, sometimes it is still very difficult to really get to that, because, of course, some of those files were also burned, some of those were lost. So we will never have a complete and full picture, but of course you can triangulate things. So for instance, some of the things are relatively easily triangulated, right? If I just give you some of the very crude facts without giving you an interpretation of those facts, I will tell you that, for instance, Horst Mahler was the defense attorney of the Baader-Meinhof terrorists themselves. But after a while, the West German authorities were suspecting him of actually running part of the terror activity. So in the 1980s, in the early 1980s, he was then himself in front of the West German court, defended by no other than the former German Chancellor Gerhard Schröder, who was his defense attorney in court. So I'm not going to draw any conclusions that might get me in trouble in front of any court, but just to make you aware that those facts are readily available online and you can actually research them yourself.
Okay, so we have a question about China. And I think this question is for Thomas, although it's not directed directly to you. So how do you see China's tacit entry into the geopolitics of the Middle East in the context of how it may address non-state actors such as the Houthis? Could redesigning the security architecture for the region, given China's mounting economic investments and expanding security concept, afford opportunities for cooperation between China and the US?
There's a lot to unpack in that question. I'll try to be brief. So I'll make a few points. First of all, I think the reality now is that there are few opportunities for cooperation between China and the US in the Middle East, and to the extent that there are some, that space is shrinking. And I have a hard time seeing how that trend could reverse in the short to midterm, at least. look at some of the key initiatives that the U.S. has been pushing in the region, which is normalization with Israel, the Abraham Accords, maybe with Saudi Arabia. Part of the idea of part of the logic of these normalization agreements, there are multiple layers to these agreements. Some of them are Iran related, but it's also to bind the U.S. to Saudi Arabia and the UAE, and to close down possibilities for cooperation, for a deepening of relations between Saudi, the UAE, and China, right? So that's the mood right now in the region. So thinking in terms of those cooperation initiatives would be nice in many ways, but it's not what is going on. I would also add, with regards to the first part of your question, one of the interesting and very interesting characteristics of China's role in the Middle East is that Chinese trade with most countries in the region has been rising and rising fast, to the extent that China is the #1 trade partner or #2 for several countries in the region. And in many cases, the numbers are far ahead of the US. And that is certainly the case for countries in the Gulf like Saudi Arabia and the UAE, which trade far more with China than with the US, while they keep their close security partnership with the US, and while they are seeking to deepen that security partnership with the US. And that there's a tension there, right? And there's a very valid question as to how long China can keep that feature of a growing economic and trade presence in the region, not accompanied by a growing political and security presence in the region, specifically in the Gulf, but in the region in general. I don't have the answer to that. Right now, China is making a fairly strong effort to limit the growth of its political and security presence. There is a growth, but it's a very small growth, and that growth is lagging far behind its growing economic presence in the region, and that's a very conscious choice by China. How long is that viable? Is that viable 5, 10, 20 years down the road is very much an open question. Let me give you an example of how China, and I'll finish on this, how China is keeping that security and political presence low. There was a lot of talk about a year ago, or 2 years ago, that China brokered, quote unquote, a normalization agreement or a reconciliation between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And that has been very much overplayed. First of all, Saudi Arabia and Iran did not reconcile, or yes, they reopened embassies in each other's countries, and yes, they very much agreed to better manage their tensions, but it remains a difficult relationship. And more importantly, China's role in brokering that agreement was very much overplayed. It was very much driven by Iran and Saudi Arabia itself, and they both agreed to bring in China pretty much at the last minute to play the appearance of having been the mediator. From Iran's perspective, that obviously made sense. Iran wants to deepen relations with China. Iran has been frustrated that China doesn't want to deepen relations more, and Iran wanted to poke a finger in the eye of the US by bringing in China. Saudi Arabia was okay with bringing in China in a superficial way as a signal to the US. See what happens if you withdraw. Right? There's a lot of anxiety in Saudi Arabia and the UAE now that the US is increasingly disinterested in the Gulf, and they want to push against that. They want to keep the US security presence in the Gulf, and threatening to replace the US with China is pretty much the best argument that they have. So ultimately, China's role was tactical, and it was of convenience. It was limited, and I do expect it to stay that way at least for a while. And I could go on for a long time, but I'll stop here.
Okay, so now we have a question for Neil. Neil, could you elaborate on if and how climate change further exacerbates violence in small island states like Haiti? And perhaps at the UN level, which are the biggest and most influential voices on the intersection between security and climate change?
That's a very good question, and it's one that requires a lot of deep thought. And I think the story of Haiti is one of great resilience and resistance. And I think we in the Western Hemisphere owe a great debt to Haiti and its people that we do not really understand. If there's ever a need for climate justice and reparation, I would argue reparation, we should look no further than Haiti. When Haiti won its independence nearly 200 years ago, it came at a hefty price, right? In 1825, France demanded 150 million gold francs in compensation for after Haiti gained independence in a slave revolt, and that estimated about 21 billion today. And the country spent the next century paying off its debt to former slave owners, France. So Haiti paid off its debt, I believe it was in 1947, about 95 years later. And as a result, what you see in Haiti, not only was Haiti isolated from the rest of the world because of global pressures from France, including the US and other countries, they were forced to deplete their natural and physical resources. So most people know Haiti has a lot of deforestation, for example. If you look at the map of the Dominican Republic and Haiti, so if you look at that island of Hispaniola, you can see one island lush forest and one is completely depleted, that is Haiti. And as a result of that depletion of resources, or it has created a lot of climate securities for Haiti. So a small storm, for example, would create a lot of mudslide, a lot of landslide, and that has created a lot of poverty in Haiti. And as we know, when there is a lot of poverty, there is a lot of corruption, and as corruption increases, then you have very bad actors taking control over a sovereign state like Haiti. So climate change has, in essence, tied to a colonial legacy in Haiti, exacerbate the security threat in Haiti that we do not talk a lot about. Haiti, as I said, is a country that created the pathway for a lot of other island states and countries in that Western Hemisphere to gain independence, and also to resist global pressures at that time. So fast forward in the future, we see Haiti as deemed as a failed state by many. There are many layers to Haiti's crisis and problems. At the UN level, I believe that Haiti's best allies probably the US, partly because of proximity, but in terms of the security crisis being an issue to the US shores, we've seen a lot in the past that Haitians have tried their best to migrate to the US, forced migration again. The Haitian diaspora is very strong on the eastern seaboard in the US. So it is both within the US strategic solution to try to mitigate the issue in Haiti, and also, but we haven't seen that happening as much as I would have wanted, as much as I expected. The thing about Haiti is that we are seeing Haiti through the lens of that current issues or the last few years, and we haven't done a good job at really investigating, really being critical on why is it that Haiti is so different compared to its neighboring country, the Dominican Republic. What has happened in Haiti that we have to pay more attention to? What are the stories of the Haitian people that is not being told? The stories of resistance, resilience, the stories of surviving against great odds, both a climate crisis, a natural resource crisis, an economic crisis and a colonial legacy that we ought to be talking about and provide some narrative on fairness, justice, reparation. That is something that we don't talk a lot about. Climate reparation, I think that is, in my opinion, that is where we should be addressing some of the issues with Haiti.
Okay, thank you, Neil. We have a question for Olena on mercenaries. So there is a significant influx of mercenaries aligning themselves with both parties, Russia and Ukraine. This phenomenon epitomizes the ethical inadequacies inherent in this conflict. A substantial portion of these mercenaries hail from impoverished nations. What is your perspective on the participation of mercenaries in this war? It's a big question.
It is a big question. It is not entirely my area of expertise, but in terms of, I mean, it's a great question because absolutely both Russia and Ukraine employ mercenaries, and I think it's fair to point that out, that PMCs are, absolutely actors in this war. But I would say that when it comes to the Russian employment of PMC, particularly state affiliated, like such as the Wagner Corporation, it's not just a PMC, it's a corporation, right? It's the commercial network. It's an extension of the Kremlin regime and the Kremlin instrument of power. So in that way, Russian PMCs really are subservient to Kremlin's influence operations overseas, not just in Ukraine, but elsewhere, particularly in Africa and the Middle East. So I would look at them as an extension of Russia's war machine, because they're not independent, right? These are not independent actors. They are entirely subservient to Russia's foreign policy and act at the behest of the Kremlin. Now, in Ukraine, it's a new phenomenon now. I mean, there's a lot of Russian mercenaries fighting against Ukraine, but there are also a lot of foreign mercenaries fighting on the side of Ukraine. The International Legion, the Foreign Legion in Ukraine is a big phenomenon. The Ukrainian government has welcomed, for nationals of other countries with any passport except Russian. You can, whatever passport you hold, other than Russian, you can actually join the Foreign Legion, especially if you have military experience, and fight on behalf of the Ukrainian forces. But it's a little bit better organized because the Ukrainian armed forces actually coordinate with International Legion, is actually embedded with the Ukrainian armed, with the regular army, and they coordinate and they report actually to the internal security service. So they report to sort of the equivalency of military intelligence. They don't report to the MOD, and they report to the intelligence services. So it's sort of I would say in that way, on balance, it's a much more legitimate employment of PMCs that have rules of engagement and that coordinate with with the Ukrainian regular army that is heavily monitored by Western capitals. Given the amount and the scale, the scope of military assistance, Ukraine has very, very strict reporting and monitoring mechanisms attached to everything that goes into Ukraine, whether it's military advisors or weapons or ammunition, technology, electronic warfare. So Ukraine is a lot more transparent, both in the use of military Western weapons, but also in terms of rules of engagement and employment of these mercenaries. The Russian way of war is a lot more, I just say, it lacks transparency and is a lot more lawless. And I think there's just a lot more unethical, as the questioner suggested, and criminal behavior. But that's sort of my my kind of general take on this. But I think it's inevitable. I think the bottom line is that, as in any armed conflict, as in any war, the employment of mercenaries is inevitable. It's sort of a natural phenomenon that is not unique to the Russia-Ukraine war or Russia and Ukraine, because it's just one of the ways in which armed conflicts often exploited. And unfortunately, that's just the unfortunate reality of war.
Okay, thank you. We have a question for Christian. The questions of what constitutes terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism, and how to differentiate a terrorist organization from a liberation movement requires clarification because, quote, one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter, end quote. In this context, where would you characterize Hamas and why?
Right. Thank you. Thank you for the question. Obviously, my answer will not give a definitive answer to that question. There's an entire academic discipline dealing with that question. So I'll only give you a little snapshot of what my answer might be. Now, me personally, I would go back to what does the law actually say? And we have a couple of definitions in the law about terrorism. So I think while we don't have an overarching globally accepted definition on terrorism, we do actually have definitions of terrorism. We have definition of terrorism in US law, and we also have a definition even at the level above the nation state. We have the legal definition of the European Union of what constitutes terrorism. So it's not that we're operating totally without legal guidelines of what terrorism is. Now, the FBI, for instance, classifies it as the unlawful use of force or violence against person or property to intimidate or coerce a government, civilian population, or any segment thereof in furtherance of political or social objectives. So you do have a definition. Now, some people might not agree because they might say, oh, well, in certain dictatorships, for instance, under Nazi terrorism or under the Soviet Union or forever, it might have been unlawful to do that as well. So, for instance, certain resistance fighters during the Second World War might have been classified under that definition as well. So that can be problematized. But in the European Union, for instance, we have a clear definition also of what terrorism is. We have a definition that relies on intentional acts, on infringements that are linked to certain terrorist activities, and that covers certain behaviors that may contribute to terrorist acts in third countries. It also then leads to approximation of level of sanctions between member states against terror groups. Now, how do you then distinguish that from other groups? The main distinguishing feature here, I would say, is when we talk about freedom fighters, we tend to talk about regimes that are of a particular nature. So we tend to talk about regimes that are authoritarian dictatorships. Sometimes we're talking about totalitarian dictatorships. For instance, one example, Nazi Germany, other example, Soviet Union. So those are the type of regimes where we sometimes relax the criteria a little bit. Should we? Now, that's a whole other debate whether we should. Also, in terms of state terrorism, what characterizes these regimes, notably, whether we're talking about the Nazi regime or the Soviet Union, is very much the use of terrorist violence by the regime itself. Now, we don't have an example of that type of activity by any Western-style democratic regimes. We just don't have any empirical example of that particular activity. So in that sense, I think, therefore, the legal definitions that we have clearly holds. And in those circumstances, we can very clearly say, well, these are terrorist groups. And in fact, the European Union regularly classifies terror groups as terror groups, and I would go with the European Union definition here also with Hamas, because very clearly the European Union classifies Hamas as a terror group.
Okay, thank you for that clarification. There is a question for Thomas. The involvement of military personnel in cognitive warfare within the context of the Red Sea security dilemma is a matter of substantial consequence. How do you interpret this particular issue?
I guess it depends what the person who asked the question precisely means. I'll focus on what the Houthis have done. I don't know if that was the intent of the question, or to include what the Americans and the British have done, which I have not looked at directly in more recent times. The Houthis have significantly ramped up their capabilities in terms of, you know, what in different contexts we could call cognitive warfare, information operations, messaging, and so on. And to a point where they are actually quite effective at that level now. And what is interesting here, and there's a broader parallel to make, is that the Houthis have worked very closely with Hezbollah in particular, and other groups backed by Iran and what Iran likes to call the axis of resistance, Hamas and others, and obviously Iran itself, to develop their capabilities. So the Houthis opened an office in southern Beirut years ago. Sometimes I see the date 2012 for the opening of that office. I'm not sure if that's accurate, but somewhere in that range. And the Houthis, learned a lot from Al-Manar, which is Hezbollah's television station. And if you look at Houthi information operations today, they are modeled to some extent on what Hezbollah has done. So, for example, to take one concrete example, the Houthis released a video after they seized the Galaxy, which is a Japan. It's complicated when you talk about shipping, but sort of a Japan-owned ship early on in the crisis in the Red Sea last fall. And the Houthis still hold that ship today as a hostage. They've actually developed it into a tourist attraction, which is on its own quite an information operation. And so they released a video, and if you go online, you could very easily find that video on various social media platforms. The music, the militaristic tone, the images, the style, the rhetoric, the words being used are quite similar to videos that Hezbollah has been doing for decades now. And as I said briefly during my presentation, this works. It's difficult to quantify, but there's more than enough anecdotal evidence and reporting on the ground in Yemen and in the region to suggest that Houthi, strategic messaging, information operations. I don't really like the word propaganda, but I think it falls into that broad category of messaging actions. It works well. The Houthis have really been able to mobilize strong pro-Palestinian feelings in Yemen and in the region through these messaging efforts to gather support, to recruit troops. Right, there has clearly been a vast increase in recruitment in Houthi-affiliated militias and units in the last 6 months, and they were suffering from shortages, so that's been helpful. And we've seen that elsewhere in the region. We've even seen it in the West, where you've had a number of demonstrations in the street that were chanting pro-Houthi slogans. I put that a bit aside in the sense that it's been symbolic more than anything else. It's not something that the Houthis have been able to milk for concrete material gain, but it is illustrative of their ability to use these events to really ramp up their profile and to translate these messaging efforts into material gains.
So thank you very much, Thomas. We're just going to finish with 2 questions as we're running out of time. And please try and keep your responses brief. I know these are really large questions and they can be examined from different angles. So next question is for Neil. How can the recognition of the term climate refugee help address the challenges and impacts associated with climate-induced displacement?
That's a very good question, and I'll be brief. It can, because the refugee terminology or crisis, or the way we define refugees as a security dilemma, is a very well-known approach. So I think the term climate refugee needs to be more within both academic and in policy. So we need to be talking about it and writing about it and researching more about it, and hopefully the two influence each other. As I said, in terms of climate change policy at the international level within the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, we do not spend enough time to talk about non-economic losses, non-economic loss and damage, and which climate refugee falls under that idea. we haven't operationalized it in a way that there is policy solutions to deal with it, or even call for research at the UN level to deal with it. So that recognition that that normalizing of climate change refugee, I think, both in academia and in policy, is crucial to deal with the associated impacts of climate induced displacement. A very good question, and yeah, and I definitely agree.
Okay, thank you, Neil. And the last question is for Olena. The US president recently allowed Ukraine to attack targets in Russia using US weapons. What do you think will be Russia and its allies' reaction to this? And the question is specifically asking about Russia, China, and Iran's reaction to Ukraine's use of US weapons. And how will this?
It's a great question, but I don't think it's a game changer. Honestly, we have been anticipating this kind of new level of permission and assistance because Britain had previously announced that they were going to allow, they made an announcement to allow Storm Shadows to be used on the Russian territory. I mean, look, the war is at a level where the Russians have now are gaining territory, and they have escalation management dominance. So this will have a tactical effect immediately on the battlefield. I don't really see any kind of bigger strategic impacts yet. And I think what China and Iran are more concerned about, or should be more concerned about, is nuclear escalation. And I think right now, the West is still within the threshold of risk allowable and permissible. I think the Western governments have not been utilizing all the room for risk, and they have been outcompeted by Russia in terms of risk taking. There is a competition for risk taking going on. That's the deterrence game. So I think that the West is well within the threshold of risk, below nuclear levels, in which they can still offset that military advantage that the Russians are currently enjoying, and help Ukraine, turn this tide and at least slow down the Russian advances and prevent the Russians from firing missiles into civilian, shopping malls and residential areas in broad daylight. So I think it's a sensible move on the part of the West in terms of giving Ukraine tactical advantage for now, that will hopefully translate into a strategic advantage. But I don't necessarily see at this point how it will change Iran's and China's position, other than there's obviously signaling. I think the West is signaling resolve. It's signaling risk-taking. And China and Iran are hopefully paying attention. So, but it's still, very much sort of a deterrence game, right? Signaling willingness to escalate below the threshold of nuclear escalation. I think, which is the most important caveat here, is that, I think that this current move is well within the allowable amount of risk that the West can tolerate. And this was a good move on their part, and long overdue, in fact. But what should matter more to China and Iran is using all the channels of influence that they do have on Russia right now. I mean, Putin, I think of all the world leaders, he's more likely to listen to Iran and China, and really exerting all the influence that they can in preventing Putin, climbing that nuclear escalation ladder, because that will be a lot more consequential than Ukraine, striking military targets in Russia.
Okay,
I'll end on that note. Thank you
so much.
Many thanks to everyone. Actually, we can't thank a lot all the speakers for their insightful interventions and for their commitment to this panel. I have to say that we learned a lot, lots of food for thought for everyone, I think. Also, huge thanks to the attendees for joining us and for their great questions. And also, Sarah, I would like to thank you, to thank our organizations, and thank you, of course, ISA and EISA, for taking the initiative to open up our communities and to discuss such issues outside of classes, conferences, and outside of our communities. We will continue with such initiatives. So stay tuned. Many thanks to everyone.
Thank you, everybody, so much. And thank you to Rebecca and EISA and all of the panelists and all the attendees for the great questions.